Tortoise and Hare Run, Saturday, April 5th. Twelve minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, the third day of April 2025. Good morning, everyone. I'm Scott Micklin. Thanks for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM right here in San Juan County, New Mexico. In Durango, Colorado, we broadcast at 103.3 FM. And if you're listening anywhere else on the planet, you've gone to our website to do that. It's ksje.com. Welcome also to our viewers who are joining us this morning. The video of this program is streaming out live to the KSJE Facebook page and also to our YouTube channel. So welcome aboard, everybody. So glad that you're with us. Coming up in the next few moments, my regular visit from archaeologist Paul Reed. He'll be talking about some of the work he is doing all across our state and the Southwest, talking with indigenous peoples, of course, and getting their input on some of the work that he does. That and more coming up in the next few moments right here on KSJE this morning. And then later on this hour, we'll be checking in with Thomas Heuser. He is, of course, the maestro of the San Juan Symphony. Thomas will be talking about this weekend's upcoming concerts of the San Juan Symphony in both Durango and Farmington, their season finale. So we'll learn more about that coming up later on at 8:50 a.m. on KSJE. That paves the way for Mick Hess, our classical music host, of course, roving with the arts, beginning after the news at 9:06 next hour right here. Don't forget, you can also connect with us on X and Instagram, and if you're a podcast person, you can find KSJE podcasts at places where you're probably already listening to podcasts. So subscribe and discover a new local program that you may have missed recently. Outside our studios here at San Juan College, it's currently about 32 degrees this morning. We are expecting a partly cloudy day today. There's still about a 50% chance of a scattered shower or snow flurry developing throughout the day with a high of only 42 in Farmington today. Partly cloudy tonight, the low down to 28 degrees. Tomorrow, another chance for scattered showers with a high of 49 on Friday. More chances for rain and snow showers on Saturday, about a 70% chance of scattered showers with a high of 44 on Saturday. Sunshine returns by Sunday with highs in the mid-50s and overnight lows, as you can see, right around 30 degrees. Back with my guests with more right after this on KSJE. KSJE is supported by San Juan Regional Medical Center, whose vision is to deliver world-class care, making life better for the communities they are privileged to serve. Offering a comprehensive range of inpatient, outpatient, and emergency care services so residents can live life better here. San Juan Regional Medical Center, community-owned and operated, here for you.
Ahead, turn right.
Isn't it nice to have a little help getting where you're going?
Your destination is ahead and 300 feet.
When navigating life's challenges, the San Juan County Navigation Center can help you with navigating housing, navigating transportation, navigating medical providers, and more. Learn more online at sjcnavigate.net or call 505-636-7110. The Navigation Center, connecting to resources, empowering lives.
You have arrived at your destination.
Back in Studio A this morning with my guest, as I mentioned, archaeologist Paul Reed is joining us. And guess what? He's not actually in a little screen. He's actually here in the studio in flesh and blood. Paul Reed, good morning.
Scott,
welcome back.
I'm so thrilled to be here. It is me. It's not an apparition.
It's really you. I can put us both in the
yes.
little boxes, but you're right here. I can actually reach over and kind of get my hand almost in front of your camera over there. There you go. But yeah, so it's amazing to have you here in person, and welcome. Great to have you here to talk about the work that you do, as I mentioned, and the reason that you're here, because, again, you'll be giving a presentation later on today, as it is, right?
I will.
Here at San Juan College.
Yes, Dr. Andrea Cooper invited me a couple of months ago to come speak to students and others who are available.
Right.
At 3 p.m. today in room 1925. I'm going to be discussing really the work we do with indigenous tribes and and hopefully, ideally, trying to help right some of the past wrongs
Right.
that happened with anthropology and archaeology, and a very colonial practice, as we've talked. And we're decolonizing it. Really, is the way to talk about it. So,
Sure.
yeah, it's an exciting time.
Exactly. And Dr. Cooper, of course, is a great professor here at San Juan College, and certainly I know is a great fan of yours, and at least our discussions, I know she listens and watches, I think, whenever you're on, which is great. Thank you. Shout out to Dr. Cooper. And great to have you here. And so that's kind of a little bit about what we're going to talk about this morning as well, right, is some of this work that you've been doing, correct?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I just wanted to do a little chat, kind of help set up the talk, and really just kind of update listeners on programs that we have that are actively going on, and the way we're, again, trying to remake American archaeology, at least in our little corners of the world.
Right, and this is a big part, I think, of the mission of the people that you work for and with Archaeology Southwest, correct?
Right, absolutely. And this is something that, we've talked about this before, but on a scale of 10 to 15 years now, we've really been trying to reorient the way we think about the practice of archaeology, and not really trying to get away from the models of the past. We still do things that are certainly very traditional, archaeologically research focused, but we've really upped our contact with descendant communities, with tribal communities, and the general public over, that, again, decade and a half time scale.
Right. And is it correct to say that some of the practices in the archaeology field of the past were very offensive to indigenous peoples in some of the ways that they were brought about?
Absolutely. There's a long history, and it has its sordidness, if that's a word. In the late 19th century, museums from the East sent people out to collect the artifacts of groups that they believed were passing, into history. So it was very much, on one hand, about preserving the cultures of the American West, but also, on the other hand, sort of extracting information, artifacts, ancestors, unfortunately, lots of data, and then taking things away, that package of data and people, if you will, away to museums, typically in the East, because native culture was disappearing. So there was a lot of really bad assumptions about what was happening. And certainly, tribes had gone through, horrific transformation since Europeans landed on the continent, and, over 400 years of different colonial actions designed to remove tribes, certainly genocidal practices at various points. And ultimately, then we're going to put tribes on reservations, and, that'll be fine. And then we'll see what happens. And then later they'll just become full-time regular American citizens. So,
Right.
kind of the really bad part of the melting pot theory. And, I'm very thrilled, and I know all my indigenous colleagues and friends are, that, indigenous communities, native communities in America are persistent. They're here, they're strong, and, they still have a lot of struggles. But anyway, we're trying to redress a lot of that past in the work we do and in the work that our colleagues do in different
Right.
organizations.
Sure. But to be clear, it wasn't bands of archaeologists going around doing this to these indigenous peoples necessarily, but it was the world that they were living in. And I guess when they
Yeah.
got to a site, then and finding no maybe current inhabitation, they didn't have the knowledge, I guess, to link maybe that to current peoples in their time. Is
in
that
part, it's
how it happened?
complicated because, there was an organization that was founded called the Bureau of American Ethnology in about 1880 or so. And it was tied to the Smithsonian. And they sent expeditions out west to study the living people, so to do cultural anthropology in some ways not unlike what we do today, and then to work on the archaeological sites, and sort of a more integrated approach to anthropology, which ironically split then at some point in American archaeology in about the 1950s and 60s. When we started to date sites, we radiocarbon dating, we started sourcing, and archaeologists got very scientific, and they stopped talking to the living people, and really just focused on, the archaeology of the past. And so departments got real fragmented at that point, anthropology departments. So the cultural people were over here. You had physical anthropologists like our very own Dr. Cooper. We had linguistical anthropologists doing this, and the field got really splintered. So that affected archaeology tremendously because we were no longer trying to work with indigenous communities to understand their places of the past. We pretty much pushed people aside, said, go talk to the cultural anthropologists. They'll collect your oral history, your stories. There was definitely sort of a denigrating view of that,
Right.
that folklore, myths from groups couldn't help us understand the past, which to my mind and to a lot of people's minds is completely ridiculous. But that's the way the field went. When I came up in the mid 80s, that's the way we learned things. We were archaeologists, the cultural people were over there. And I was fortunate to go to New Mexico State in a relatively small program. So I knew the linguists, I knew physical anthropologists, I knew cultural people. In big departments, you don't talk to those folks. If you're an archaeologist and there's 100 archaeological grad students, right? You're doing your thing. You may not even talk to the people working in Peru if you're a Southwesterner or if you're working in Egypt. So,
right.
we call this siloing, right? And I think it got tremendously siloed. So what some of us are trying to do, to make my rather long story short, is bring anthropology, at least to some extent, back together and to really honor indigenous peoples and their perspectives on the past and their concerns for managing their own ancestral places.
Right.
Which, talking about it now seems incredibly obvious, but it wasn't obvious.
No, right.
Which we slipped away from all that.
Exactly. And I guess that is maybe where some of these stories came about the abandonment, if you will, of Chaco Canyon or Aztec ruins or Salmon ruins, things like that. And where do those people go? Who knows? Or they're gone, and we have no idea. And now, of course, we know a lot more, I think, about the peoples and their connections to the land and the other peoples that live around the land.
That's exactly right, Scott. And, there's, to this day, you can put in Google searches and say disappearance of native tribes or Pueblo disappearance, and you'll get all kinds of crazy theories about what happened to the people who actually live all around all of us here in the Four Corners states, So we don't have to go across the landscape tracking down descendant communities. They're literally right here. And so this is why in the work that I do, and when I talk about things, I don't refer to Chaco as, quote, a lost civilization. That's a really bad way to talk about it. Certainly the
And isn't it insulting to people that have links to it?
It absolutely is. But the irony is the people who have talked about, lost civilizations think they're honoring that past and saying, hey, these folks achieved amazing things. We know they did, and that is the cool part of it. But to talk about Chaco the same way we talk about Stonehenge or Newgrange in Ireland, where we literally have no idea who those people were ethnically or culturally. We know they were in those places 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, that they went through transformations, that waves of people came in, the Celts came in much later. All that very interesting, European history is there. But if we put Chaco into that lost civilization category, we totally divorce, the ancient Pueblo people from the modern Pueblo people who all live in this area, this region still, and who make frequent trips back to their ancestral sites.
Right.
That's what we're losing. So we're just trying to reconnect the real obvious dots that have been there forever.
And that's not necessarily a new phenomenon, is it? That the current Pueblo people make trips back to these areas, and so for whatever reason, 100 years ago, just the archaeologists didn't make that connection, or weren't talking to the people, I guess, in discovering that connection?
Yeah, it is really somewhat mysterious to me as to how sort of that severing happened. One of the earliest expeditions into Chaco, the most well-documented one, was a 1849 trip by Lieutenant James Simpson, who was on an assignment. This was a huge expedition that went out to the Navajo country, and Simpson was sent on a detachment to explore Chaco because word had gotten around there's this amazing place. So he went in there. Well, his guides were talking about, quote, the Aztecs, in part, having built this great society and these ancient sites, and it was kind of like, really, they just passed through the Pueblo country, because to get to Chaco from Santa Fe and the seat of the territorial government, once
along the Rio Grande,
took
right?
over, you come straight west and you pass right by Jemez. In fact, one of Simpson's guides was a man named Hosta, who was the governor of Jemez Pueblo at that point. He came on the trip, but he apparently, and this is reported, I have some skepticism, he apparently told Simpson and the folks that, well, the Aztecs built these. And so I do wonder if that was potentially throwing
misdirection,
the Europeans off the trail and not wanting to reveal things, because the other side of this, of course, is that Euro-Americans have gone in and demanded information from tribal peoples, worldwide, indigenous people, for years, for decades, for centuries, probably for millennia. So maybe that was a little bit of misdirection, but it is kind of weird in a way, right? And then in our own backyard, Aztec ruins, right, is an amazing Pueblo site that dates, in the 1100s and 1200s. But somehow the Aztecs got credited with building it. So,
right.
And, there are stories. The Aztecs themselves have a story of wandering from the north and then going way south to help found their society. And we know peoples migrated far and wide.
Right.
And that's fine. But it does it does really sever Pueblo people from their own history to say, the Aztecs built it, we know they didn't, or we don't know who built it, and they all left. So now we have, quote, abandoned sites.
Right.
That's not the way a lot of us are trying to think about it anymore.
Gotcha.
Because the other thing is, to modern indigenous people, these sites still have very much life in them, and they have deep ceremonial connections and ancestral ties. So they're not abandoned.
Right.
Excuse me, in any sense of the word.
Right, exactly. And that is a lot of the work that you are doing with these current Pueblo tribes and governments and tribal councils and things like that. And so then now, and it's not just you, but is this still an accepted, I guess, understanding in the archaeological community, or are there still some holdouts that are maybe a little bit tougher to explain it to, I guess, or to come to the understanding that there are connections between the Pueblo and native peoples with these sites?
No, I think the connections are pretty clear to people, so I don't see a lot of people resisting that. What they are resisting, though, in other parts of the state, and in the West, is working with indigenous tribes as they try to do archaeology. And again, this is just the severing of the practice. Archaeology's over here, cultural work's over here. Now, I think one of the positive changes I have seen over this decade and a half or so is more and more archaeologists becoming interested in having the descendant groups have a role in what's going on in studies. In fact, the magazine I brought is, This is not our most recent one, so I'm kind of teasing everyone. We have one we just put out on Mesa Verde National Park, which I actually didn't bring a copy of that one, but if you remember, here's the shameless sales pitch. I think for only $30 a year, you can get our magazine. But this one was the prior one, so it came out in the fall. And basically, better for it is a metaphor. We're talking about doing collaborative work with tribes and with descendant communities. So anyway, the point is, let's not do our archaeology over here and not involve the groups who care the most about a lot of these sites and landscapes. Right.
And I guess the other thing, too, is there's a big push, I think, part of it from you and your organization, Archaeology Southwest, the organization that you work for, and to get more Native American archaeologists into the field and going through the educational process to get the degrees and the certifications to do some of this work and actually have that really first degree perspective of what's going on?
Right, exactly. So with the field school that we do every year, we set aside money for scholarships for indigenous native folks to come and do it. And, and we're really trying across, I think, our universities in general to get more and more enrollment of native and indigenous peoples. But, this circles back in part to the idea of archaeology and that kind of work not being a good or not being seen as a cultural good for a lot of these communities. So that's part of the process we're going through to try to have folks understand that we are in sort of an evolutionary part. We're in an evolutionary process to change the way we're practicing it. And one of the interesting things about this is, obviously I'm a non-indigenous person, and people can look at me and say, well, okay, is he just another do-gooder, right? Passing through the area. My friend and colleague Dr. Wade Campbell is a Dene person who's from Window Rock area in a community not too far from there. Wade goes out and does work. He's actually a professor at Boston College. And so Wade goes out and works in different points on the reservation and often gets questions himself from local Dene folks saying, why are you doing the white man's archaeology? So Wade really has to do a lot of sort of counseling, if you will, and explaining that he's trying to transform American archaeology in an indigenous way, by himself being an indigenous person. But he encounters a lot of resistance and folks saying, maybe you shouldn't be doing this kind of work. So I talk about Wade only because that's an example of how difficult it can be to practice archaeology in communities where archaeology is not a good word.
Right.
So, we have a lot more work to do there. And that's in part what I want to talk about this afternoon.
Sure.
And the talk later is what we're trying to do to sort of redress that. And, just hopefully through time and, showing up in places and saying, look, this really is a different approach.
Right.
Very true. Things can be different than they were in the past.
Right.
But then part of that, too, for me, Scott, is offering apologies to people when I see them face to face for these prior practices, which were incredibly harmful to groups. So I think we have to come to it with that authenticity and some humbleness and say, these were bad practices. So
From not that long ago.
not that long ago
Is the other point that I think is important to make.
And a lot of times people want to push these things way into the past because then we're detached from them, but this isn't that long ago.
Only a generation or two.
Right, exactly. So we as archaeologists with consciences, and the desire to make things better, need to really work hard on that and pull people into our projects. So
Exactly.
That's my usual. When I get on my
Your soapbox?
my soapbox,
Yeah.
that's what I want to talk about.
That's a good soapbox to be on, though, and I think a good message to hear. And are some of these academic programs maybe expanding the scope a little bit to maybe have, if you're in, School of Archaeology, are you getting a little bit of a class or required to take a class maybe in some anthropology or things like that to maybe break down some of these silos for the future folks who'll be going into your profession?
Yeah, that's a great point, Scott. I am very encouraged by seeing that in my younger colleagues. So folks who are, between mid-30s to, just a few years younger, who've come up in programs where they're trying to do more of the four-field, which is all four fields, and requiring students to spend time doing, at least understanding cultural anthropology, and then as they're doing their own research, being encouraged to do some collaboration as much as possible. I think we've got a long way to go in the academy still, and part of the issue I see is people my age and older have not developed the ties, a lot of them, if they haven't done collaborative work with tribes. So they're not able, for example, to say, hey, I've got 5 master's students and I'm going to have them come out because I'm going to work with Zuni this summer.
Right.
If they don't have that connection, they're not doing that, the students aren't going to get that exposure. So, but nonetheless, I am seeing a lot more of that in different programs, and especially with younger scholars. So,
Nice.
so that makes me very optimistic for the future. And just having these discussions, a lot of times I kind of get those looks like, okay, here, I'm not quite a boomer, but it's like, okay, boomer, right? All the cultural memes about the older person saying this and this, but for a lot of my younger colleagues, they've already gotten it. So if I'm saying it, they're kind of like, hey, finally, you came around to what we learned.
Right.
So that's very encouraging.
That's a good thing, sure. And I guess, too, we talk about a lot of the building of trust in this field as well, right? When you're going out into these very sensitive, maybe, areas, and being able to explain to the indigenous peoples and folks who have these connections that, you're going to be respectful, but you're there to do the research. You're there to kind of see, what you can learn from these specific sites. And that takes a while, I guess, to develop that kind of a trust, does it not, over what's happened in the past?
It does. And there are situations where discussing places with people, they may want to talk about things, but they don't actually want any of that information to go anywhere else. And so this can be a challenge.
You mean there are things that we don't talk about on this show?
Yes, that's right. And anybody who has worked extensively with tribes has sort of this, I'd say, in some cases, people who've done it for decades, vast amounts of information that they're holding on to, they're never going to publish, but they felt like working with tribes was a very important thing to do, and not just to produce that next publication. So this is a real change as well, and I think our organization is trying to do this where we don't, have these requirements where you got to put out 2 or 3 articles every year. Because if you're in a high-achieving academic program and you're trying to get tenure as a young or even a middle-aged professor, you've got to do your publications. So if you're working with tribes in a situation where there's confidential information, you're perhaps trying to help tribes understand their own past, but not for any goals of your own. That's pretty big. But then you're not going to get publications that count towards, your tenure goals.
Right.
So that's a big challenge. And I think, since we want to deconstruct everything, Scott, the academics really need to change some of that approach as well. And that's not just anthropology. That's pretty much across every field of study. You have to publish. The publish or perish thing is very real. At that level, fortunately for us, we are an independent nonprofit. We're doing a lot of different work. We do federal contracts. We do private work. We do donor-based study, donor-supported studies. Mm-hmm. So we have the ability to develop the relationships without having to end up with a publication at the end, which might mean talking about things that maybe folks didn't want you to talk about. And
right.
That has certainly happened in not even that far into the past. So
interesting.
Those are things we try to be very, very sensitive about. And there are some projects that I've been part of where in the end, a cultural group, a tribe might not be comfortable sharing really any aspect of it. I did a project with Acoma a few years ago. We signed an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, so that Acoma would be in control of all those data, everything we found. In the end, there were some concerns about sharing things, so we used some of the information to offer recommendations to BLM when they were going through, this lengthy resource management plan amendment process that we've talked about a few times.
Right.
But there was sensitive cultural information that in the end, the Acoma Council and the governor at the time felt like that shouldn't go outside beyond the public. So that's where it sits.
Gotcha.
And that's something that we have to be comfortable with as folks working in this field who truly want to honor indigenous concerns and, wishes. So
Sure.
But if you're trying to publish, that's not great.
Right.
So fortunately for me, I don't have to publish. So.
Well, true, very true. But that pressure, I guess, is real, and it does, I guess, permeate the industry in some cases, not all, but some, and that's what is a concern.
Absolutely, and it's the same thing as doing any kind of project. If you don't produce a report, then you haven't, in some ways, honored your agreement. And I'm not saying that we should all just go do what we want and never report on it. Responsibility is a good thing.
Sure.
But it's a different thing working with indigenous groups, and it's kind of a fine point, but I think it's a very important one.
Right. But if all sides, I guess, know from the beginning that there may be some culturally sensitive or confidential things that are discovered during this time frame, and everyone agrees that doesn't need to go anywhere or needs to stay with the indigenous people, government, tribe, whatever the case may be, that's probably a good place to start.
Exactly. And that's why when we talk about working with groups, you start from the beginning saying, okay, these are goals we might have. What are your goals? And then instead of just saying we're the researchers, we're the scientists, we're the saviors wanting to extract information, what are your goals, and are there things we can help with?
Right.
So that's turning it around and truly trying to work in a collaborative way, which, again, I think is relatively new in our field.
And from the tribal perspective, I guess the other question I would ask would be, what's the reaction been from them to suddenly maybe be asked, what do you think about what we're doing on your sensitive, culturally significant lands? Or how do you think we should proceed? Or what would you like us to be cognizant of as we traipse around this very sensitive spot?
Right. I think, a lot of the groups I've worked with are thrilled. They're very happy that we're doing this. But one of the things we bump up against then, if we're wanting to partner and have groups out in the field, even if we have funding, a lot of times they don't have the personnel. So the capacity issue is really big. And that kind of leads us back to getting interested tribal members into different programs to get the bachelor's and the master's degrees and PhDs that are necessary to do some of this work. Because we do run into that frequently. Some of my friends who are tribal historic preservation officers say, well, it's great that you've been encouraging people to do this, but our requests have gone way up now from where they were 10 or 15 years ago. And they're like, we love being consulted, that's great. But for a lot of this, we have to say we're just not able to be involved at this point in time. So that's something that we got to continue to work on.
Sure.
As well.
Sure.
And try to support.
Right. But it's going in the right direction.
I think so. I definitely think so. And it's not that everything is perfect. There are missteps and we have miscommunications. So that's why kind of circling back to the relationship part of it. I know on a prior show, Scott, I talked about a collaborative model with tribes that we put together with 4 R's. The first R is relationship, and you have to build a relationship with folks to be able to do anything. So that means you can't go in and say, hey, I'm Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest. Here's a 900-page report we did on some sites that we understand might be ancestral sites for your group.
Right.
Can you review this in 30 days? And obviously this sounds really ludicrous to talk about it, but that has been in the past a model that some federal agencies and some groups have used that, we need to get tribal input, so we're going to send them this massive report. And maybe the hope there from the part of some is, they're not going to have time, they won't review it. That's not collaborating. That's not really consulting. That's checking a box and saying, hey, we were supposed to do it. We did it. So
right.
the way to not do that is to start a discussion as early as you have a project or you want to do a project and say, who are the groups who might be interested. And sure, you send out some letters and some emails, but then make some visits, make some phone calls, start to build those relationships. And I think I've been really fortunate with the work I've done to have a lot of those in place now. So if we have a new project, I can talk to folks who are my colleagues and in many cases my friends and say, are you interested in this and how can we move forward? But it took time to build those relationships. And again, this sounds very obvious to talk about, but it hasn't been the model that's been pursued at all. And, on the part of the federal agencies have a requirement to consult. And I think some are better than others. But a lot of times they'll do the same thing. They'll send a letter and say, well, we contacted 30 tribes and only 2 responded. It's like, well, have you met any of the people that you sent letters to? Because if you haven't met with folks initially, or at least had a phone call, that relationship, you can't just snap your fingers and create it.
Right.
It takes time, just like any of our relationships in the world. So again, that's kind of back to this is fairly obvious. But you have to build in timelines that allow visits, contact, and what I would think of as non-extractive visits, where you're not going, hey, I want to go ask you about this site and pick your brain and find out all this. That's not what any of the indigenous groups I work with want to have, is somebody they've never met coming to them and saying, hey.
It seems very pushy.
Very, very pushy.
Yeah.
And it's just, who wants to deal with that?
Right.
So anyway, we've learned some of those lessons, and I think we're better understanding how to build the relationships and actually end up with something at the end of a project that maybe meets our anthropological, archaeological goals, but more importantly, meets the goals of the indigenous group that we were partnering with.
Sure.
To the extent that they have overlapping interests. And sometimes we get responses like, we're really not interested. It's like, well, that's great.
Right.
It's good to chat. We'll move on and get back in touch next time.
I was going to say, that doesn't necessarily end it, but it maybe puts a pause and a break, and you can circle back around perhaps and try it again.
And sometimes the timing is just wrong.
Yeah.
I've been doing a multi-year project down at Petroglyph, and some groups connected immediately. Others came in later, and we were thrilled to have the involvement we had at different points in time.
Sure.
But that's why it's nice to have the long timelines. You can't accomplish things in just a year or two, typically.
Well, that's a hard concept for some folks to understand.
It is. And this is not like we're going to go build a bridge, right? And we'll do this. And, these are human relationships, and they're complicated.
Sure.
And you have to do them right.
Well, and multicultural ones, too, I would think, as well, right? So
Right.
there's that involvement as well. Well, Paul Reed, I'm sorry to say we are out of time. It flies by whether you're here or in some other remote location, but it happens every time when we get together. But we want to remind folks that you'll be here at Savon College talking about this very topic this afternoon from 3 to 5 p.m., room 1925, which is on the first floor of the West Classroom Complex. I know that is where it's located, kind of near the bookstore, if you're familiar with that area, audience, and your parking lots. I know F is one of them that's in that area, so hopefully folks will come and find you and hear more of what you have to say on this important topic.
Yes, thank you, Scott. Appreciate having the opportunity to come and speak as always, and looking forward to meeting with folks this afternoon.
Yeah, very much so. Well, thank you for being here in person and for the work that you and your colleagues do, and again for your always willingness to share it with our audiences each and every month, Paul. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank
you, Scott.
Good to see you. Paul Reed, Archaeology Southwest. He is here on the Savon College campus later on today, 3 to 5 p.m., room 1925. My guest on KSJE. KSJE and the San Juan College Native American Center present the Student Study Tip of the Week.
Hello and good day. My name is Demetrius. This is your study tip of the week. Studying without distractions is crucial. If you're studying alone, try to find a quiet space or put headphones in to block out noise from your surroundings. If you're in an area trying to study and it's just not working out, relocate. It might be frustrating to have to pick up and move, but it will be worth it once you're in a good environment. Consider putting your phone on silent or vibrate too. You can always respond to your messages after your study session.
The Student Study Tip of the Week is presented by the San Juan College Native American Center and KSJE.